an attempt at an explanation of the cultural history and the political history of the factions, of the culture war in the 21st century. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Everything begins with the new millennium, 2000. We're 23 years into it. But I think it still remains a singular event, just like the long 19th century from the French Revolution to the First World War, and the short 20th century from the First World War to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The 90s are kind of an in-between time for us in the States. It's kind of a golden time. Because in 2000, everything went to heck. You know, the election of 2000, that's what created the political culture of today. It's still with us over 20 years later. Now, others have written about the political divisions of the 90s, but they didn't fully metastasize until the Bush presidency. With Bush's uncertain legitimacy and his election, and then 9/11. That was the watershed. And with that, you had those who supported Bush and those who opposed Bush. And there might have been a gradient between those two, but it was their support for Bush and the Patriot Act and the Iraq War and everything coming out of those things that we really see these divisions form. This is the world that Jon Stewart grew out of. A lot of you might be familiar with this, but there are some young folks and folks who just weren't really tuned in. The Bush years were that awful. The left was completely right to oppose Bush in every conceivable way. It might have gotten tiresome at the end, but, man, totally justified. And sure, there was Ron Paul in like the more libertarian faction. He's really fascinating to listen to on the floor of Congress. But the left, as we understand it, grew in the Bush years. And so Obama took that energy. He knew everyone was mad. Well, at least most of the country was mad except for the hardcore believers. And those who followed Bush, especially around 2008 and afterwards, they were, we lost, how do we deal with this? And that force metastasized into the Tea Party. And conservatives mostly could never, not openly anyway, deal with the fallout of the Bush years. So when they talk about things going bad, they blamed Obama. Obama wasn't great. You know, he made lots of promises, but those promises were not really fulfilled. And there are those, like the Strauss-Howe generational theory fourth turning guys, who say 2008 was the change year. Listen, anyone who focuses on 2008 and not 2001, do not trust them. They are partisan hacks. They focus on Mr. Mean Bad Obama, who wasn't great, as a way to distract from the disaster that was George W. Bush. There are those who realize that the evil stems from the Bush years. The Patriot Act, torture, war, religious conservatism, which does predate Bush, but he kind of was their guy. And then Obama happened. And the hope and change spirit, it lasted for a while. It lasted until, 2011 was kind of a year of revolutions. Mainly in the Muslim world, Arab world, I should say. And even here in the States with the Occupy movement. There are those who say that identity politics, which grew up around that time, was an attempt by big money to separate that 99% 1% spirit. I think you can make a pretty good case for it. But then after 2012, things started to shift. You could say the faction that brought Obama to power in the first place, they got greedy. They got a bit mad with power because they won big in 2012, and let me tell you, they deserved to. They deserved to push back against the right, not just for Bush and the post-Bush fumes like the Tea Party. And the right didn't really have anything. So the left kind of pushed further and further. Gay rights were finally winning. They were finally pushing back against the religious right, who basically alienated everyone over the past 15 years. You're wondering why religion has been declining consistently for decades? It's because of the religious right. And in 2012, they lost big. And a lot of people were fighting for in the 2000s. They finally came to pass in 2012 with the legalization of pot, more openness towards gay marriage. But of course, things are always shifting. There's two things you have to understand. One, there are no monoliths. There's no singular force. Anyone who tells you there's a singular force, they are lying to you. There are lots of little forces all going on. And for that reason, number two, everything is dynamic all the time, especially when it comes to politics and factions. Both who has power when, what they do, what they want, what people will accept. So from maybe 2011, especially 2012 to 2016, the coalition that brought Obama to power, inspired by the horrors of the Bush presidency, it all kind of fell apart for them because that force was itself a coalition made up of at least two major factions. I like to call them the hobbyists and the activists. Now, the activists, they in many ways, though not all, imbibe the spirit of the 60s, especially the revolutionary spirit. The desire to people power, fight the power, to form organized blocks to end the tyranny of existence. That's not necessarily unreasonable in and of itself. But that's the spirit of the 60s, and it's not the 60s anymore. Not in the 2010s, especially not after 2012. But then you've got the hobbyists. And the hobbyists are different. We know what an activist is. But what's a hobbyist? I mean, obviously, someone just pars around and has fun and does their own thing. Well, with the religious rights, that was their target. How dare you enjoy Harry Potter, Pokemon, video games? That's satanic! It was the satanic panic of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that really inspired the hobbyists. But in 2012, religious conservatives were finally being pushed back. And now, with an empty field, these two forces, who were united against Bush and the conservatives and their own little factions, the neoconservatives, the religious conservatives, and the business first types, well, they were all scattered. And so the factions turned on each other. These were both left-wing factions, but with initially Elevator-gate and then Gamergate, they realized that each other were the true targets. The hobbyists just want to be left alone, enjoy their hobbies, their video games, their books, their comics. Just want to be left alone. Whereas the activists, they want to keep permanent revolution. Just keep the spirit going, no matter what. There's always new targets. There's always a way to make the world better, no matter what other people say, even other left-wing factions. The core mistake of the 2010s was not realizing that these cultural forces were a left-wing civil war. Gamergate was a left-wing civil war. We know this from the primary sources, from looking at a lot of Gamergaters themselves. It was not initially a right-wing movement. Even Sargon wasn't initially right-wing. You go on Reddit, Kotaku, and Action. A lot of them start off very left-wing. But there's this great comic that was released, I think, a couple of years ago, which kind of shows the dynamic. The activist wing were the ones who took power because they're the ones who care about power because they want to change things. And so they saw this kind of hobbyist uprising against them. as a right-wing movement. And that was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the right wing, stinging from their defeats in 2012, they saw an opportunity. They saw, oh, hey, the left is in a civil war. How can this help me? And that's what happened. They took the revolutionary energy of the hobbyist left and they turned it towards their ends. And what's really interesting, they were actually quite clever about it. They had a cleverness that kind of completely dissipated by now. When Milo Yiannopoulos spoke with Dave Rubin, you can kind of see like an empathy for these guys that no one else on the left was showing. With Gamergate, the left kind of betrayed its own principles, its own values. Because it thought that Gamergate was a right-wing movement, and it was not. That's what it became. But the thing is about Trump, he was a very different character from Bush. He might have had some of that energy, but he spoke against the Iraq War. He spoke, maybe with minimal effectiveness, against Bill O'Reilly. He was a different force. He was actually willing to fly the LGBT flag. Can you imagine anyone doing it now on the right? No. There's lots I hate about Trump. Like he can barely put a few sentences together. And he's just a nasty clown. But he's not like the evangelicals or the neocons. Maybe kind of like more like the business types. I think he would fit in there. But he just seems motivated by just a general nastiness rather than any sort of particular animus. And so Trump was able to build a new kind of coalition, which included some ex-left elements. And then it was just all kind of a mess. But then the right got greedy. Gradually. Over the Bush years. We won! And they had their own internal fights, of course. But then then Trump lost. And all the meanwhile, especially during the chaos of COVID, the defeated right was able to reassemble and reassert themselves, and they used anger at COVID to build a new message. It wasn't explicitly evangelical. Well, that was certainly there. It was purely, entirely anti-woke. It was appropriating the language of the left-wing civil war of the mid-2010s. But there's nothing left-wing about it. It's purely right-wing, purely going against that. You talk about wokeness, you talk about the social justice warrior left, what I call the activist left, because I think it's much more neutral and more descriptive. But the main takeaway is these things are fluid, complicated, multifaceted. There are no monoliths. This was my journey anyway. I was definitely hardline left in the Bush years and in the early Obama years. And then 2014, for a variety of reasons, I was like, wait a minute, the left is going nuts. I wasn't able to go full Trump. I don't know, I just didn't really care for him much. But I couldn't support Hillary. And it was because she seemed to be like the epitome of that, domineering, snide, ever-present, always looking, you better not be doing the wrong thing. I couldn't vote for her. So I voted for Gary Johnson of the Libertarians. With Trump, I was just, gold seemed right to me. 2020, I guess I resigned for the Libertarians again. Not with as much enthusiasm. It was more just, not Bernie. Biden actually turned out okay. Surprisingly. But now, especially since last summer, Republicans have gone back to their old tricks. They have taken on the exact sensation of the Bush years. Maybe not in the foreign policy element where they are kind of taking the old left-wing view, which is confusing, and I kind of agree with on maybe a couple ways, especially on reducing military funding. But man, that animus against trans people, that reeks of the anti-gay sentiment of the 2000s, and I want nothing to do with it. Whereas in the mid-2010s, it really felt like the activist left was acting way too much like the religious right. I think there's something to be said for that. Maybe might have pushed that too far. But things change. Things always change. And so what's happening now is you have people who are primarily animated in the mid-2010s, and they think that the right-wing movement, especially against trans people, is of the same energy as the movement against the social justice warrior left. It's easy to make that mistake, but it is still a mistake. And here's how you can tell. That anti-social justice spirit had the language of punching up, kind of Whiggish, fighting the power, fighting tyrants. But this spirit against trans people, it's purely, to use the words of the mid-2010s, punching down. Oh, how dare these lessers do horrible things. Thoughts have feelings. There is a sensation with certain thoughts, certain phrases. You can kind of sense it a little bit. And those sensations are an expression of those ideas. Everything's kind of connected. Not like a hippy-dippy woo way, but considering that words, the things we write, are the products of our thoughts, there's a mind-hand connection that you can sense if you really think. If a certain sensation is linked to certain ideologies. That's kind of how they are. You got a certain feeling, you want to bring that feeling into the world in a certain idea set. And you can sense those feelings. In a materialistic, you can feel them. Like communism and fascism feel different. Liberalism and conservatism feel different. In a nerve sort of sense. You can see it even in the type of media that's consumed. Maybe I'll get to that another time. I hope this was a good overview. Let me know if I missed something very obvious. Peace out.